Well, hello everybody. I hope you can all hear me okay. Welcome to our second Evolving Conservation Leaders seminar. Now, a few housekeeping notices before we begin. This is actually a Zoom meeting, so what I would ask you to do is, could you all keep your cameras off and your sound muted during the course of the seminar? That will just make sure that we don't have any sort of background noise, and also make sure you're on speaker view rather than gallery view, so you should be able to see that on your menus. That will just make the whole experience much better for you. So yeah, so just if you could keep your camera off and sound muted, that'd be brilliant. Anyway, I'm very pleased to welcome you to what is our second Evolving Conservation Leaders seminar. Basically, this we think is a great way to showcase the fantastic work of some of the young people that we work with. Hopefully you all know all about the Osprey Leadership Foundation, but basically we're a charity who work with young people in the early stages of their career, to support them really to find their voice and to really reach their potential. And we know that the young people we work with have some amazing potential, and to be honest, they're already doing some fantastic things. And tonight we've got three really excellent speakers lined up for you, Amy, Andy and Brittany, and they're going to be talking about different subjects. So we're going to start off with Amy's talk, which is all about turtle dove conservation. We'll then go on to Andy, who's talking about Caledonian Pine Forest and restoration of Caledonian Pine Forest in northern Scotland, and then we'll finish with Brittany, who's going to talk about her work with Ospreys at Poole Harbour, including her PhD studies that she's working on at the moment. So I think you're going to be in for a really good evening. I'm sure that as the talks go on, we're going to get loads of questions. So if you have a question, then please can you just stick it in the chat, and what I'll do is I'll keep my eye on that, and then I will ask the speaker those questions at the end. Each talk's going to be about 15 or 20 minutes long, with a bit of time for questions, and then we'll be finished by 9 o'clock. So basically sit back, relax and listen to these three fantastic talks. Now, hopefully by the wonders of modern technology and Zoom, Amy and also Bethan can hear me. So Amy, if you want to turn your video on, please. Hello, Amy. Here's Amy.
Hi, Tim. Thank you.
So Amy is going to present her talk on turtle doves. She's going to be helped by Bethan, just because of the technicalities of trying to share presentations, which I won't bore you with. But basically, yeah, without further ado, I shall hand over to Amy, who's going to talk about researching the foraging habitats of turtle doves in Essex. So Amy, the floor, or the Zoom floor, if you like, is yours.
Oh, thank you, Tim. Hi, so I'm Amy, and this evening I'm going to talk a little bit about researching the foraging habits of turtle doves in Essex. This is a RSPB project that I've been lucky enough to be involved with over the survey season this season. I will start with a little of my background and my journey to becoming involved with the Osprey Leadership Foundation. Next slide, please, Bethan. So I didn't really have a traditional route into conservation. I'm a career changer, working previously in the ambulance service. My conservation journey started with Lincolnshire Wildlife Trust volunteering. So I was working in the shop at Farrings. I went on to be a conservation and education intern with them for a year in 2019. It was quite early on that my direction was going to be botany. I was able to get involved in a really great project running at the time called the Love Links Plants Project, which was a great project that aimed to fill the gap of the declining knowledge of Lincolnshire's flora and create a modern herbarium. I learned tons from the project and was able to apply what I'd learned in sharing skills with others as a wildlife watch leader with the Trust. I apologise, but I haven't found an effective way of photographing botanical activities without it just looking like people staring at the ground. So there's a couple of photos of that, and me sharing my skills and encouraging others to stare at the ground as well. So I progressed from the internship by returning to study. So I studied plant biodiversity and habitat assessment methods. And following this, I was thrilled to bits to secure my first paid work with World Ecology. Then last winter, I added to this by working as a ranger for Suffolk Coast and Heaths AONB. And I was working a lot with people trying to influence behaviours to try to mitigate recreational disturbance. And it was at this point that I joined the Osprey Leadership Foundation. The job at the time, it was an incredibly solitary role. So the positivity of the OLF group was just what he needed. And it really gave me the opportunity to reflect on where I wanted to go next. So next slide, please, Bethan. So where I went next was the RSPB. So working within the RSPB Centre for Conservation Science. So they work throughout the UK and overseas to discover practical solutions to 21st century conservation problems. So their research projects aim to highlight the important problems, their causes, and then test the solutions to inform conservation action. Turtle doves are one of the core species that the RSPB is focusing on at the moment. So that leads me on to the next slide. So why is turtle dove focused research needed? So there's been a massive population decline. So this has gone from 125,000 pairs in 1970 to then just 1,200 in 2021. So this equates to a 93% decline since the 1970s. So what are the causes of this decline? So the first two are linked really. So that is decline in accessible seed and then disease. I'll talk a bit more about this later, but there has been an observed dietary switch in turtle doves, and this has a really big link to disease. So diseases turtle doves are particularly vulnerable to are trichomonas, and this can cause really devastating effects in birds. Other causes as well for the population decline, so migration hazards. The birds migrate on the Western Flyway, so they migrate to Western Africa, Senegal each year, and there are unsustainable hunting levels on migration, so they might encounter other problems as well, so like sandstorms and other weather problems. Another reason for their decline, so trees are being lost from their wintering grounds. So there's been big habitat loss, and this can be from agriculture and big population increases over there. So there's lots of factors that are driving this huge decline. Luckily though, there's lots of initiatives that aim to help turtle doves. So things like supplementary feeding sites and sown plots. Operation Turtle Dove are doing lots of work to inform and advise landowners. And this is where the research kind of comes in. So research is really needed as we really need to measure how successful they are. Are these plots working? Are they still working? And are we getting it right for the turtle doves? Also, so it's not just about turtle doves as well. So quite often you see that if you aim to help one species, it might help to another species in decline as well. So providing a balance of undisturbed nesting, natural foraging and drinking sites as well may well benefit other species as well. So linking this to my role, so next slide please, Bethan. So I've been working as a research assistant and I've been based within the RSPB Turtle Dove Friendly Zone in Malden, Essex. So I've been working as contract staff for the project that is looking into the foraging habits of turtle doves. So my main focus has been collecting data by conducting botanical and habitat surveys from locations that have been highlighted where our tag birds have visited. And now I will describe a typical day in the job. So next slide, please. So each day, it's never been the same, but there has been an order and a process to the season. So early in the season, the task focused on getting the bait sites ready for the return of the birds. All the equipment was put in place early for the birds to get used to, and the traps were all securely set open until a designated trapping day. So on a trapping day, these traps are constantly monitored by the named professional on the licence. So at every stage, the welfare of the birds is paramount. Also in this early stage, we spent a long time reviewing camera trap footage, just so you can get to know the habits of the birds and when they're visiting. I have included some footage here, as I've particularly enjoyed seeing the interaction between the turtle doves and other species. So yes, there is a rabbit in the trap on that one. So once we had started to catch the birds, radio tracking was our next main task. To be able to do this, you need to try get within approximately 100 meters of the bird to download the data of the bird's location since the last download. Here, the locals were really, really forgiving of what looked perhaps quite strange. So you spend quite a lot of time wandering around, holding an antenna, trying to pick up the birds. But actually, this was a really, really good opportunity to try and engage with people about the birds. Like, people were really quite interested to what was going on. And then later in the season, so the main bulk of the work was the botanical surveying. So yeah, loved every minute of that. And we were surveying each location that our birds visited. And leading to the next slide, please, Bethan. So focusing on the project, I did mention before that there'd been a dietary switch that had been observed in turtle doves. And this has been from natural weed seeds to moving towards them eating more cereal grains. So in the 1960s, the turtle dove diet was really high in natural seed. That was what it was majoritively. And then by the 1990s, it become mostly cereal. And this is still continuing to be seen as well. And there is two main drivers that can explain dietary switches in birds. So the first one is where there's an increase in a new appropriate food type. And the second is where there's a reduction in the preferred food type. So in turtle doves, this switch has occurred simultaneously when decreases in natural arable plants was observed. So there has been a big decrease that's been seen since the 1980s in arable plants. And this is due to farmer practices, pesticide use. And the 80s is quite an important time to consider, really. So with these two drivers, for turtle doves, the explanation of the dietary switch is a reduction in the preferred food type. So their preferred food type, it's just simply not there in the abundance that it's needed. This is a problem for so many reasons, really, because are there the correct nutrients in this now less varied diet? What about chemical contamination? Because if it's a cereal crop, is that crop being sprayed? And how will this impact on reproduction rates? And another thing as well, just what is it doing to a species' natural behaviour as well? It's really interfering with that. So the RSPB project aimed to build a clearer picture of what feeding resources are used by turtle doves and what that is currently, with an objective to test whether turtle dove conversation work is helping to meet their needs. And then Next slide, please, Bethan. So to meet the aims and objective of the project, the methods for collecting the birds' locations needed to be considered. The project used satellite tagging to pinpoint the locations. So why use satellite tagging? Turtle doves are a very challenging bird to observe. They also spend very little time actually feeding. So to see these trends in the data, quite a large data set is needed, and this would have been really difficult to achieve without tagging. The welfare of the birds is really paramount. So by following strict guidelines under license from the BTO, that's the British Trust of Ornithology, tags were applied to suitable birds. Only adult birds were caught, and the weight and health checks were done prior to the tagging. The satellite tags were then set to give fixes appropriate to the study. So in this case, multiple fixes were set throughout the day, just so that we could really try pinpoint those likely foraging locations. And I'd just like to share our survey methods for this season as well. So 10-meter radius plots were centered on, firstly on the bird GPS location, and then on 2 control plots as well. And within these 3 10-meter radius plots, you record and map every habitat patch, then a comprehensive list of flowering and seeding plants, and as well sward heights and percentage cover of different vegetation types and things like bare ground, because that's quite an important thing to survey as well. So, next slide, please, Bethan. So team achievements of the season. So we were able to tag 8 turtle doves this season, and we were able to survey all accessible, likely impossible foraging locations. There were a couple that weren't accessible, mainly because they might have ended up in the tidal salt marsh, so we weren't quite able to get to those, but we were able to get to all the others. So that equated to 220 locations that we were able to survey. Season highlights for me. So yeah, big main thing really was the massive hospitality from the landowners. So this ranged from farms to businesses, religious communities to private gardens as well. So it must be yeah, really unusual, to be honest, to have someone knock on your door saying that a satellite tagged bird has flown onto your land, and is it all right if we do a survey? But all these people are just so welcoming, really, really interested to learn more about the doves as well. So no, they've been absolutely amazing. A big highlight for me as well was the opportunity to Skillshare. So there was lots of opportunity for me to share my passion for plants. We had some really, really great volunteers on the project, and it was a total pleasure to survey with them. We're really grateful for all that hard work, just from helping with all the plant lists, to try pin down the birds to get the data from them with radio tracking in the first place. So no, big shout out to the volunteers on this as well. So another highlight was just a glimpse into, you know, where these special birds have been feeding. That always felt really special to me, and it was just constant learning process, really. Some surprises. It's quite good to just test my idea of what I thought was a good foraging site for them, and I was able to get to see birds actually foraging in the real as well, so that was really quite special. Yeah, so the results, watch this space. We've finished with the data entry stage. My contract's now come to an end, and starting with the data analysis now. So we hope that this will inform management in the area and beyond as well. So the future for me. So next slide, please, Desmond. I'm afraid that I've included just another photo of me staring at the ground again. as I hope to be continuing with my botanical focus for a long time to come. I'm also going to be continuing with the Turtle Dove project as the volunteer and help with just compiling the data and help with that analysis stage as well. I will continue with my other volunteer roles as well, with the Wildlife Trust, with helping with winter practical work and surveying. So yeah, I will be carrying on with lots of stuff like that. I just want to share my thanks for all the people that I've been lucky to work with so far, all the Links Wildlife Trust, Coke, RSPB, Store Estuary Group as well, and yeah, to World Ecology and Yorkshire Coast Nature for giving me the opportunity to make my dream a reality. And then to finish, there's a final slide, please. So the Turtle Dove has strong connections in folklore and history, so it is associated with devotion, loyalty and partnership. Really beautiful qualities that I quite admire. So let's all be true to the dove and work together for their recovery. Thanks so much for listening to me. Thanks so much. And do check out Operation Turtle Dove's website for advice and how you can help. I can put a link to that in the chat box if anybody's interested. And the RSPB as well, they do have designated turtle dove officers that can help as well. So if anybody is interested in this, particularly if you have a connection to East Anglia, please do get in touch because I can pass on details of these people that can help as well. So thanks so much for listening, and thanks Bethan for doing the slides for me.
Thank you very much, Amy. That was really great. Really fascinating. And you know, it's such an iconic bird that you know, it's really great to hear about the work that's going into, you know, understanding the decline, because it is a shocking decline. I mean, I remember at Rutland Water 10, 15 years ago, you used to be able to walk down to the hides overlooking the osprey nest and see maybe 5 or 6 turtle doves on the wires over the meadows at Linden. So it really is shocking. And so, you know, to hear about the work that is going in to understand that decline is just really, really fantastic. Amy, and I hope you're still there. There's just a couple of quick questions.
Yes, I am. Sorry.
That's all right. I panicked a bit because I thought I'm not going to be able to answer these questions. But yeah, there's a few questions. So we've got a few minutes just before Andy's talk. So I'll just go through them in order. So Alessandro asks, what was the tagging GPS software that you were using?
The software that we use for it.
Yeah, or I think perhaps he means the GPS tags that you were using.
Oh, like the tags we use themselves. I can't remember the name exactly of it. Was it BioTrack or something like that? Sorry about that. It's
no, that's okay.
Not
but
the best, but they were very lightweight ones. So it was GPS ones that we used. So they only actually weighed, they were about 3.5 gram. So they were a very lightweight one. And it's one that kind of transmits with the radio beacons, so that you don't have to retrap the bird or anything to get the data back off. You know, it's one of the really good modern style ones, so that you can just keep getting that with the radio tracking kind of thing. Yeah, and I can really see hopefully that answered that question okay. Yeah,
and I can really see how if you're able to pinpoint the place where the bird is feeding, you can then really get a good idea of the diet in a way that just wouldn't be possible without that technology.
Yeah, we did lots of tag tests as well to test the accuracy. So the 10-meter radiuses was based upon that, so that any kind of inaccuracy of the GPS was kind of picked up within that. So, you know, all being well, that location was definitely within that 10-meter radius kind of thing. It means lots of recording, but when you love plants, it's fine, you know. Yeah.
I can imagine. Now, Jane is asking, you mentioned about some of the engagement you did with landowners. She said, really incredible to hear about your positive experience with the landowners. Just curious, what exactly the process of reaching out to them was, and did you have to tailor your pitch to particular stakeholders?
No, that's a really good question. It really was pretty much like how I described, that it was knocking on people's doors, because we were so busy, to be honest. Like, you know, we had these 220 locations that we had to get around, and, you know, the summer's quite short, isn't it? So it really kind of actually was the case, and we were just, you know, hoping that everybody would be really nice, and they were, and they were just really wanted to help. I found that when, you know, because all our birds were named, so I kind of found that if, you know, you said like, oh, and our bird's called this, then they were a bit like, oh, it makes it a bit more personal. And, you know, people just, yeah, they were absolutely lovely. We engaged with loads of people. You know, the birds did sometimes go back to the same locations, but quite often it was all different ones. So we just used to, you know, we were able to go all across the area really and get to speak to lots of people about the doves. So it's good.
That's great. And kind of related to that point, Nikki Rivers, who's one of the associate mentors actually on the ECL program, she says, sounds like a great project and experience and lovely to see the doves. Did I see on one screen that you could play their song? And we did joke about this earlier. So Bethan, we might need your technological know-how in a minute. But Nikki also asked, did you put any of your leadership learnings into practice during your work?
Yeah, definitely actually. Yeah, the course was really good that I did with you guys, and there was a lot of kind of involvement with volunteers, like I've mentioned how great they were and everything. So yeah, it really did give me the kind of confidence to be able to, yeah, do that and go like, yeah, okay, I love plants, but I can kind of use the skills I've gained from the course to go like, yeah, I can do that. Like, you know, yeah, I got good feedback from them as well, that they said, oh, you delivered it in a good way, and we knew what we were doing and felt set up to actually go out there and record on our own. So yeah, so thanks to you guys. Yeah.
Well, no, it sounds like you've done a really fantastic job, so well done. Now, Bethan, I don't know if you can hear me, but I think we've got to have a bit of Turtle Dove song, haven't we?
Definitely.
We can't finish a talk about turtle doves without hearing a turtle dove purring. So it's a sound that you don't hear in the English countryside very much now. So are we going to manage it? It's a bit tense. Bethan's got to find the right side.
I hope it works so I don't have to do an impression.
Can you all hear that, or is it just me hearing
Thank you.
It worked. Thank you, Bethan.
Well, that seems like a very nice way to finish. There's a few more questions. So, Amy, I don't know if you want to have a look at the chat and you could perhaps reply to, there's a couple more in there, but just so we can keep the time.
Yeah, cool. I'll reply in the chat box. Thanks so much, everyone.
No, thank you. And Neil says, great talk. I hope all your hard work leads to turtle dove recovery. And I think we can all echo that. So yeah, thank you very much, Amy. And thanks for a great talk. So moving swiftly on from turtle doves, we're going to head north to Scotland to hear about the restoration of Caledonian Pine Forest. So Andy, hopefully you're there. There you are. He's actually in Edinburgh tonight. So we're by the wonders of Zoom, we can go up to Scotland. So Andy, I think without further ado, I'll let you get started. And then at the end, we'll just do the same thing. So if you have some questions for Andy during the course of his talk, then please just pop them in the chat and I'll ask at the end. So here you go, Andy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tim. I'll just share my screen. And I'm going to try and let the pictures do the talking because that's easier for me. Hi everyone. Thanks for having me along. So yes, I'm at least one of the Scottish based contingents of the Osprey Foundation. A little bit about me quickly. So I joined the Osprey leadership course back in 2020 during lockdown, and it was absolutely perfect timing for me because I was very down in the dumps, on furlough, feeling a bit useless about everything. So it all came along at exactly the right time for me and for my career as well. So ringing endorsement from that end. I guess I'm a jack of all trades ecologist, basically. I'm a conservation officer is my technical job, the technical term for it. But I'm basically an ecologist who does paperwork. And for the purposes of this talk, really, my main function is counting trees. So I work with the National Trust for Scotland at the Marlodge Estate National Nature Reserve. This is Marlodge Estate National Nature Reserve. And it's one of the best places in the country for seeing Caledonian pine woods. One of our most important habitats in Scotland, and certainly one of the Scottish habitats that adds the most to the sort of overall UK biodiversity. But the pine woods are really part of the big boreal belt of woodlands that go right the way around the world. And they're very ancient. I mean, we could talk about the influence of man on them in due course, but by definition, these are Scots pine dominated woodlands. They've persisted uninterrupted in their current location since the last ice age. They're kind of a relictual habitat now. There's not much left of them. There's about 18,000 hectares, of which we at Marlodge look after about 1,000 hectares. So we've got about 5% of this special habitat left. And again, by definition, it's only really found in Scotland. There's a specific Scots pine subspecies that's only found in Scotland, which is all very exciting. And it's a hugely important habitat. Kappa Cayley, Scottish crossbill, one of our only endemic bird species, depending on how you think about red grouse. And then it's also home to things like pine hoverfly, twin flower. And we kind of know it's a bit knackered in general. It's suffered, particularly over the last couple hundred years. A new threat is climate change, particularly out in the west, where higher rainfall is not very good for pine. But the main issue is really high levels of herbivory, and that means red deer. This is what we think about, when we think about Caledonian pine woods. We think a closed canopy woodland, perfect habitat for Scottish crossbills. And again, a nice excuse for me to just put a nice snowy picture in there. So that's pine woods. So Marlodge. I've taken to calling Marlodge the radical centre of Scotland. It's slap bang in the middle of Scotland. It's the farthest you can get from the sea in Scotland. It's 2 hours north of Edinburgh, 2 hours south of Inverness, slap bang in the middle of the Cairngorms National Park. It's a big place. It's the UK's largest national nature reserve, about 30,000 hectares, so 300 square kilometres. In this picture, you can see about a third of it, I think. It's not just Caledonian pine woods, although that's a very big part of what we do. We also have the high tops, Ben Macdui, some of the 4 of the 5 highest mountains in the country, actually. But what makes it radical, and what gives it that radical edge in the centre, is that it's a place where different people were forced to come together in common good. So due to the way that the place was purchased by National Trust for Scotland, only back in 1995, so not that long ago at all, we have a legal obligation to, first of all, conserve the habitats as best we can and restore them as best we can, because quite a lot of them were pretty degraded back in the 90s. Also promote outdoor access for all. So up in Scotland, one of the things that sort of is slightly different to England is basically people are allowed to go wherever they want, whenever they want, which is great if you're a hill walker. Absolutely, fabulous. But we also continue to do field sports, and this is the radical nature of the thing. It's a place where people from different walks of life are coming together in common cause, usually rubbing together fairly well. Although we'll talk about how that works and how it doesn't work in due course. So that's where I live, basically. Is what we do rewilding? Sort of. The term rewilding doesn't often go down particularly well in the Highlands. The Highlands has a long history of clearances. People move from the land for all sorts of reasons. Rewilding, unfortunately, it's a little bit of a straw man term up here, and it's taken on connotations of clearing people from the land to make way for wildlife, however incorrect that statement might be. There is a Gaelic term which I prefer using in the context of what we're doing, and that's called Dúchas. It's this idea of unity existing between land, people, all living creatures, nature, and society. Basically, what we're trying to do at Mar Lodge, and I say basically because it's really not basic at all, but we're attempting to reconcile disparate strands of the estate's nature, culture, and social history into a nature-oriented whole. And you can read there what that kind of looks like. To be completely honest with you, we're an estate that uses rewilding principles as tools to fulfill management objectives, which is essentially nature restoration at a landscape scale. But we do that alongside other traditional land management practices. That's quite an important distinction, and is one that helps with this idea of a radical centre and an idea of talking to people who might not be fully on board with what we're doing. We aren't specifically a rewilding estate. We are an estate that uses rewilding principles when it works for us. So a big thing of my job as an ecologist, jack of all trades ecologist, is working out when it does work for us and then telling people about that. So this is why something that should be quite simple in conservation terms is actually really quite difficult. With the Caledonian pinewoods, we know the issues: non-native invasives, climate change, and the main one, overgrazing by particularly red deer. Now you'd think the estate's owned by a conservation charity, got a legal obligation, among other things, to restore the pinewoods, which were getting really quite degraded by the time the trust came along. You'd think it'd be easy, you know, you just reduce the deer densities and away we go. But we need to think about history, we need to think about local cultures when we go into conservation stuff. And this is the Stag Ballroom at Mar Lodge. So Mar Lodge was one of the original stalking estates. When we think of the monarch of the glen, when we think of red deer in the bare highlands, that really started at Mar Lodge right back in the 1790s. The estate has been a hunting forest for over 1,000 years. It's also been tenanted, it's been forested, it's been crofted, it's been burned, it's been, you know, you name it, it's happened here. It's been cleared for forestry operations, resettled, then cleared again. There's some great social history from the 1840s and 1830s of crofters compelled to give up their fields to the deer of the forest, to kindle in their breasts of those that remained a spirit of hatred against the offending proprietor. So there's a long history at Mar Lodge, and for the last 200 years in Upper Deeside, we're only 5-10 miles from Balmoral, of course. In Upper Deeside, red deer really has been king, the monarch of the glen, truly, for the last 200 years. And of course, when you have lots of herbivores, you get zero woodland regeneration, because the deer essentially eat all the young trees. And that's happened for 200 years. So what you're left with is a pinewood that looks very nice, but it's also dying on its feet. It's just granny pines, very old stuff, senescing, running out of seeds and all the rest of it. So that's where we came in 1995. Here's the plan. Well, you can see what the red deer do there. I mean, this was taken just down the road from us, actually. And you can see there's no young trees. There's very little cover. There's basically a bit of a field layer of a bit of scrappy heather and not much else, because everything else has been eaten. So this was the plan. We'd reduce the densities of deer on the estate, not to nothing by any means. We've got a big estate, so we've got places where we can have higher densities and lower densities. We weren't going to use fencing, because that creates lots of symptoms. It's not natural processes led. not great for capercaillie and other things flying into them. And importantly, we were going to continue functioning as a Highland sporting estate. So as I say, we had a legal obligation to do this, but also, if we're being really serious about landscape scale change, we need to be talking across cultures. The work at the time, this is back in 1995, was pioneering, particularly in Royal Deeside, just down the road from Balmoral, in a place where the red deer really was the monarch of the glen. And so we come back to our rather lovely ballroom. Queen Victoria loved it in here, by the way. She was a big fan of the dance. So balancing all of these things is actually quite difficult. We've got a legal obligation to continue field sports, a legal obligation to bring the site back into favourable condition, to regenerate the woods, save them, wider environmental benefits and costs, and then some of the more tricky ethical, moral, cultural, perceptive sort of issues. What does it mean to conserve a landscape? Does it mean conserving cultural conventions? And also, how do we perceive landscapes? One person's regenerating woodlands, another person's dying moorland, and vice versa. So it sounds simple. It actually took the estate maybe 10 or 15 years to really get on top of this. And the issues were adaptive management, and the issues were cultural at the end of the day. So did it work? Well, a big part of my job is fixed point photography and mapping and all of that sort of stuff. This picture is one of the glens on the estate. It was taken in 2011. And you can see at this point, there aren't any young trees. We've got very open Caledonian pine wood in the front. There's a plantation in the back, a few birches knocking about. Arrow Strait River, not much going on, to be honest. So I retook this photo, about 1,000 others in 2021. And this is what it looked like. So big change. Starting with the river, it's re-wiggled itself. That was due to some storms, and actually that's been really useful for all sorts of rare plants and rare invertebrates, which I spend quite a lot of time mooching around looking for. The non-natives have been removed from the plantations. A few of the tracks have been removed as well. But the main thing, of course, is you can see lots more trees. And this is the first time in 200 years that we have natural regeneration at a landscape scale across all of the woodlands of the estate, essentially. So it's all very exciting. And it means that I have lots of things to count in summer. At the same time as this, we did some mapping. So this is back in 2011, before I was at my lodge. And in 2011, things were just sort of beginning to get underway. The red areas are areas with young trees in them, which are above the height of adjacent vegetation. And there's about 155 hectares in 2011, which people thought was sort of fine, but could probably do with jivvying on a bit. So we redid this in 2021. And we have quite a bit more regen now. So we now have about 2,000 hectares of extra regenerating woodland, which is all very exciting, and it's a big mixture. So there's areas with incredibly dense regeneration, and there's areas where it's much thinner. And that goes down to things like soil conditions, and there's still herbivores knocking about, but you're never gonna kill all the deer in the area. So there's, still areas with higher deer densities and lower deer densities. There's competition between birch and pine, which we're just beginning to get to grips with at the minute. It's all quite exciting and interesting science. So it's all gone quite well, and I've been really lucky because I turned up after everyone else had done all the hard work, and I've just got the chance to monitor it all as it's beginning to sort of take off. So more fixed point photos. You can see the whole history of the woodland here. You can see the felled pines. They were felled in 1943. You can see some old elements of Muirburn there, just about creeping through. And you can see the very, very last remnants of the Caledonian pinewood. So this was 2011, and that's 2021 again. So alongside the mapping and all of that, we do other bits and bobs. We've basically found since 2011, 120%, 1,200% increase in trees above vegetation height. We're beginning to see, yes, interesting relationships between birch and pine coming through. We're seeing rare species return, things like twin flower, we're finding all sorts of new things of theirs. And we're beginning to get to grips with some of the more biodiversity-based stuff now, things like willow warbler abundance and orchids and all the rest of it. It's not just pines. We think of pine woods as being pine woods. That's probably slightly a simplification, and it's slightly due to well, things like herbivore levels. So if there's sort of medium herbivore levels, then pines will get away. If there's very low herbivore levels, you'll get birch away, and the birch will outcompete the pine and all the rest of it. But also humans like pines, they're very valuable. So we think over the years pine woods have become more piney than perhaps you'd expect them to be in a sort of quote unquote natural state. So it's not all pines. Here's some birch woods getting away, which is very exciting. And more of the same. So this has all been very exciting. And one of the really surprising things, and one of the really interesting things for me to look at, is things now happening at altitude. So the sort of youngish, semi-mature pole stage pines down the bottom of this picture, they're sitting at about 550, 600 meters altitude. So what you can see is pines romping up the hill. They're getting up to about 700 meters altitude now. So we're seeing the beginnings of the return of a natural tree line, which is incredibly rare in Britain. There's only about 600 meters of it left in the whole country. And we're beginning to see it at a landscape scale. In Marlodge, we're not the only place. So, you know, there's other places like Glenfeshie and Abernethy and a few other smatterings of places where this is all coming together at the same time. But this also highlights the importance of natural processes. So you can see where the pines are getting away on really dry areas. They're not getting away in the wetter areas. There's more competition with heather. So this is really what we're after. We're after these diverse ecotones wending their way up the hill. And they really are wending their way up the hill. This that little hut there is a bothy, highest bothy in the country, up at about 650 meters altitude. So these little pines are getting away at about 680, 700 meters altitude. So when we talk about, you know, rescuing the Caledonian pine woods, we mean it on a very, very big scale. So that's all very exciting. And I guess the new frontier for us is sort of working in the mountains, which is great for me, but it does mean I have to walk quite a lot to all of my sort of camping sites. So this is Glen Quickie. That's Loch Nagar actually in the background, that little nipple. So that's Balmoral Estate over there in the background. So yes, what can we learn? So delivering landscape scale ecosystem restoration alongside other things like respecting cultural traditions, even if you are challenging them simultaneously, it is possible, but it's only possible through dialogue, collaboration, respect, and working with people from different backgrounds and cultures, making them part of the decision-making process, and all the rest of it, all the stuff that actually can be quite difficult from a conservationist perspective. To that end, rewilding really does put people at the heart of any potential management intervention going forwards. Marlodge is not at wilderness, despite what you might hear in sort of superlative sort of newspaper articles. It's got a long, rich cultural history. There's been people here as long as there've been pines, and there's been pines here as long as there've been red deer. So the three really do come together to create this fabulous landscape. And also landscape scale restoration projects throw up a lot of surprises. So I think for us going forwards, a big part of my job anyway is trying to capture those surprises in some sort of systematic way. And we're definitely going to miss stuff, and I'm not looking forward to, well, I am looking forward to trying to do it, but I'm also definitely going to fail a little bit at capturing all of it. So that's me, I think. So that's what I get up to. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you very much, Andy. That was a really fantastic talk, and pretty inspiring to see what's going on at Mar Lodge and the change that's taking place, and the fact you're able to record that change so well. I can see a few questions coming in, so if anyone else has got any questions, then please put them in the chat. So one from Seb here. Very interesting work, Andrew. Historically, would there have been mixed grazing in the Caledonian pine from now extinct species? And if so, do you think a reintroduction of other grazers would benefit the landscape? And are there any plans to do this?
Yes and yes. So yeah, so I mean, deer have always been in the pine woods. I think one of the issues we have is the woods were so knackered, so spent, that we really needed to push back all herbivores for at least a small, in the short to medium term, to give the trees any chance of getting away, to really kickstart those natural processes. Going forwards, I'm very much looking forward to seeing red deer back in the woods where they belong, and they will be sooner rather than later. So going forwards, what we'd expect is red deer, roe deer, and also cattle as well. So just over the other side of the hill from us at Abernethy, they're working with Highland cows at the minute. That is an interesting project looking at the impact of cattle grazing on capercaillie conservation. We are getting some cattle next year, and I think we're putting them in the woods the year after. We've also experimented with pigs in the past, and they do a really good job of thrashing everything up and creating new spots for regen. But you do need them at quite low densities, otherwise they just eat the regen. So there are those things going on. Interestingly enough, one of the first reintroduction schemes in the UK happened at Mar Lodge, and it was in the 1820s, and it was the fourth Earl of Mar, no, sorry, the fourth Earl of Fife, who owned the place at the time. He loved shooting and he loved sport, and he wanted wild boar to shoot, so he got a job lot from Sweden and stuck them in, and they all died. There wasn't enough food for them. They ate all the ant nests, and then that was them gone. So that didn't work. He also tried introducing chamois sheep. Unfortunately, that didn't work either, because King George IV decided he'd take them for himself. So they ended up in Windsor. So the only reason the Highlands aren't overrun with chamois sheep is because George IV wanted them for himself, for his own collection. But yes, no, sorry, going forwards, cattle.
Excellent. And yeah, you're gonna, I think you're gonna be in the same position as Amy. There's a few more questions. We're not going to get through them all. Cormac's asking, great talk, Andy. Are the deer numbers only controlled by the field sports on the estate, or do you also have any dedicated deer stalkers? And if so, how do you manage their activity? Do you carry out some form of deer impact assessments?
Yeah, great question. So adaptive management is the key here. So we do have sports shooting, as I've said. A lot of that happens on the open hill away from the woods. In the woods, the long-term objective is to go back to sports shooting for that, and then for that money goes back into woodland conservation. But we do need dedicated stalkers. So we have a stalking team that split their time between working with guests and working in the woods. It's tricky work, to be honest. It's really hard. So they do a really good job of it. it's grim work, to be honest with you. I mean, I've done it a few times, and it's hard, and it's cold, and it's, it's all the rest of it. We do a lot of herbivore impact assessments. I'd say about a quarter of my job is doing herbivore impact assessments in one form or another. So they then feed back into how. So I essentially, the way I describe my job really is an environmental auditor. So I'm kind of working out what's going well and what isn't, and then if stuff isn't going well, then feeding it back to the team and trying to work out ways to do it better. So yes, we do it macro, micro, and all points in between. Yeah.
Brilliant. And I think we'll do one more question from Anna Williams. Is there any discussion to introduce predators into the landscape in the long term to help control those deer numbers naturally?
There are discussions. There are always discussions. So the discussion that's gaining traction at the minute is with lynx. Most of the discussions are based on the other side of the Cairngorms, where there's a sort of group called Cairngorms Connects, we've got 300 square kilometers, they've got 600, annoyingly. So there is talk of it, but it's not really getting anywhere particularly quickly. The reason being, so for example, we're a big national nature reserve, we'd be a good candidate place for lynx, but even still, we would only be able to host about 3, looking at the modelling. So maybe a mature male and a couple of females, which is not enough for us to unilaterally do anything ourselves. And our neighbouring estates are, or in woodland areas anyway, our neighbouring estates are sporting estates who happen to have sheep and aren't particularly keen on the idea right now. So I think it will happen sooner rather than later. I think a bit like beavers, floodgates will open and they'll be done. But I can't help but think this is a job for Scottish government. The reason being, if Scottish government did it and it was a manifesto promise, then there would be a democratic mandate for it in a way that a unilateral move from a conservation charity wouldn't be able to have. So it'd be less of an imposition. And again, that's really important when we're thinking about cleared landscapes and all the rest of it.
Brilliant. Well, it's certainly a complex thing to think about, but I for one would love to think that one day lynx will be roaming around that landscape. It would really an exciting prospect. Anyway, thanks so much, Andy, for a really brilliant and fascinating talk. And I think you're being very modest because you didn't mention at all the fact you've written a book about all this. Was published, was it last year? It's called Regeneration: Rescue of a Wild Land. I was
a bit modest, but I do have one.
Oh, good. There we go. Go out and buy it. You can buy it at all good bookshops. I can't recommend it enough. So yeah, so make sure you buy the book to go with that fantastic talk. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
So, yeah, thank you. We're now going from one end of the country to the other because we're going down to Poole Harbour in Dorset to hear about ospreys. I should also say, Andy, hopefully you're still listening. There's still some questions in the chat. So if you could perhaps head over there and reply to them, that'd be brilliant. But yeah, we're going to Dorset now to Brittany, who is going to talk about ospreys at Poole Harbour and her work on the reintroduction project and also her PhD. So Brittany, over to you.
Thank you very much, Tim. Thank you everyone for coming and for listening and for waiting as well till the end. Hopefully this is going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour of ospreys in general. If I can condense that down into 15-20 minutes, I'll do my best. So my name is Brittany. I have been involved in OLF since 2019, actually. So I think I was a member of the first cohort of intake of the Becoming a Conservation Leader scheme. And I heard about the charity through being fortunate enough to work alongside Tim through some of the work that I do. And it's just been a fantastic experience and one that I'm thrilled to see is growing and developing. and one that I feel has personally benefited me enormously in ways that I had really anticipated when I started. I'm just going to give you a bit of an overview of my work that I'm doing alongside Tim on the Osprey here in Dorset, but also up in Scotland as part of my PhD. Just give a bit of background about me. There I am in my element. I'm a conservationist. I do have a particular focus on birds and raptors, increasingly as well, just specifically ospreys. So I'm really backing myself into a nice niche there. Like Tim said, I'm based down in Dorset, and that's where I grew up. In terms of my academic background, so I did my undergraduate degree in biological sciences at the Queen's College, Oxford. And I'd love to say that I'm one of those people that knew from yay high that I wanted to be a conservationist, but actually nature was always an interest of mine. But I don't think until I got to a certain age that I actually realised it could be a career. I know that some other people will probably feel the same. And it wasn't really until I actually, in year 10, I did my work experience at the RSPB Reserve at Arne, which is here in Poole Harbour. And I was privileged to meet a lot of very inspiring people there who showed me that actually, this was a viable career path, and actually one that was very much worth taking. So I pursued that to my undergraduate level, and it was during that time that I also started working with Birds Poole Harbour, the charity that I still work for today. My route into that experience was quite odd. It was a combination of hard work and luck, which I think most people's experiences are actually. It happened actually when I was still at school. During my A-levels, I got the opportunity to write an essay about anything I wanted. And I knew I wanted it to be about conservation, but beyond that, I wasn't really sure. I didn't necessarily have a niche interest yet. And my dad handed me a cutting from a newspaper that showed a picture of a really striking bird. And I've actually found the newspaper cutting. I kept it. It's an article by Simon Barnes in the Times that says, "The bird that defied extinction." This is the first time I'd ever seen an osprey. And it makes me quite emotional, actually, thinking about how much that moment has shaped my career, because not only have I gone on to manage the translocation project to restore that species to the south coast of England, but I'm also now studying the species for my PhD research up in Scotland. So I'm just going to give you a bit of an overview of both of those things, and they are quite tightly interlinked. So there's no real order to that. I'm just going to tell you a bit about the story of the osprey. Just to briefly, in case anyone doesn't know about ospreys, I'll just give you a little bit of an overview of their ecology. So they're a long-lived raptor species. As you can see from the picture, they're quite an enigmatic species. They are very unique because they're long-lived. You can get to know individuals, and they're very site-faithful as well. So they're a species that people do seem to get quite attached to, which it has its benefits, it has other disadvantages, but on the whole, it's something that we can use to help with the conservation of the species. The title of that newspaper cutting kind of doesn't really acknowledge the fact that this species is actually a pan-global species. They're not really a threatened species globally, so they're found on every continent of the world with the exception of Antarctica. Some of those populations are sedentary, they're resident all year round, and some of them, like the Palearctic Western European population, are migratory. So they have to be quite generalist, really, to survive in all these different places, particularly migratory individuals. They need to be quite generalists in how they're able to obtain their food, for example. But actually within that, they are very specialist in that they only eat fish. And they're very well adapted to that, from the scaly feet, the really long talons, which you can't quite see in that picture, but if you stick your hand into a box with an osprey with it, you'll definitely know about it. They've also got all these specializations in their eyes and their beaks as well. They are really effective hunters of fish. And actually that was one of the things that led to their decline as a species, a breeding species, and actually extinction as a breeding species in a lot of places, particularly in populous countries in Western Europe. They were seen as a pest because they were taking fish, which was particularly few centuries ago a very important food source for a lot of people, and it remains that way in a lot of parts of the world to this day. So they were actually lost as a breeding species in the UK back in the early 1900s. And there was a sort of a period that followed of approximately 40 years where there's no sort of definitive records of any birds breeding again. But thankfully, they did sort of persist in these refugia in the less populous countries in Scandinavia. And it seems that birds from those populations did actually come down and start to recolonize these lost populations again. And one of those is at Lochgarten, which I'm hoping some people might have even actually been up to Lochgarten and made the pilgrimage up to see the ospreys there, as many people have. And there was one pair there in the 1950s that were being protected and kept very secret, but then actually the decision was made, quite a significant and radical decision, to open the viewing of that nest site up to the public. And that's really set the tone for osprey conservation in the UK for the last half a century, really. People are very much involved in the conservation of the species, and to great effect. And the story from there has been really positive. Like the article implies, the bird that defied extinction, there are now over 300 breeding pairs in Scotland. The recovery of the Western Palearctic population as a whole is very positive. However, as you can see from this map, this was the sort of the population distribution at the last survey, so that was in 2015. You can see that there's still lots of gaps in the population. So you can see that big refugia in the north, but a lot of the historical range has yet to be recovered. And there's a couple of major reasons for that, and it's to do with the population ecology of ospreys themselves. So first of all, there's something called natal philopatry or philopatry, which basically means love of the homeland. It's site selectivity, it's site faithfulness, but specifically to the natal site, to the place where an individual was born. And we see this particularly in male ospreys. They are very unlikely most of the time to disperse sort of beyond maybe 20 kilometers from their natal nest site to where they actually choose to breed themselves. The females can often disperse a bit further, and they're quite important in the genetic mixing of populations. But actually, even then, they and males as well both show and demonstrate something called conspecific attraction, which means that they generally like to go and are attracted into areas where other ospreys are already breeding. So what that means is that the population spread itself is actually really quite slow. But fortunately, there's a few conservation tools that we can use to help with that. And that's again where people are coming in and being important in the restoration of the species. Sometimes it's putting up artificial nests, which ospreys do take to quite readily. But actually, by far the most successful tool that's been used so far is translocation. And actually, you can see from this that a number of the translocation projects that have already taken place throughout Europe are ones that have now successfully led to the establishment of other populations, including Rutland Water, where Tim started his career. But I'm just going to talk you through what's happened down here in Dorset with the translocation project that's been going on here since 2017. So yeah, one fateful day in July 2017, Tim arrived in an enterprise van from Scotland, and he handed me my first ever osprey in a cardboard box. And as you can tell from the picture, it was a pretty magical moment. Those birds were collected from a population, healthy part of the population in Scotland, which has been well monitored. We know that the population is sustainable and that the removal of some chicks from that population won't negatively impact the long-term viability. They're then placed into these release pens. They're provided with as much food as they can possibly eat, and we all retreat and we monitor them via CCTV. And then we give them a period of a few weeks where they're acclimatized to their new surroundings, and they continue to grow and develop until they meet those final milestones that show us that they're ready for release. And one of those was one of the things that bird there was just doing, which was wing flapping, and eventually they learn to fly and get over onto those perches. And that's when we know they're ready for release. And at that point, the there's one very important thing we have to do, which is to tag them so we can track them when they're out and about. We fit them with a radio tag, which is really tiny. It's only about 2.5 grams, and it slides onto the central tail feather. I've actually got one here. This is from one of the birds that we released last year. He managed to dislodge it a few hours before he left the pens. So unfortunately, he didn't take it with him. So we didn't know where he was going. And actually he disappeared for 2 days and then turned up soaking wet. So we have no idea where he went during that period. We'll never know. But it's a nice little example for me to use during my talks. So it's very light, slides onto the central tail feather, and it just emits a unique frequency for each bird, which we can then track within a range of about 3 miles. So we're only monitoring them when they're close to the release area, which is exactly what they do, at least for the first few weeks after release. They tend to return to the pen site. They very much associate that as being like the nest. They come back there for food, which we continue to provide for them. We're replicating the behavior of a breeding adult that's caring for them. And then we're also monitoring them visually as well. And as time goes on, we start to see them ranging further and further afield. And that's when we take the opportunity to really do some good education work about that. So that's when we host our boat trips, which we run throughout the last few weeks of August. We take members of the public out, not only to see the translocated ospreys, but the migratory ones as well, and also to see other birds in the harbour. So plenty of people are coming back now on other boats that we're running and wanting to see eagles and all sorts of other things as well. We do talks, we do lots of engagement work generally out and about and at events, but also you can see in the top right hand picture there, we're also trying to pass on the knowledge that we've gained through this process. So I included on the map a few proposed translocation projects that we're hoping to go ahead in the coming years. One of those is the project in Ireland, and that there is the Irish team coming across so we can share our knowledge and sort of pass on our understanding that we've gained, because it is quite niche. But that's what we're all about at Birdspool Harbour. It's very much sharing our understanding and learning. And people have taken to that really, really fantastically. They are really, really supportive. And actually they kind of have really not only supported the project, but actually they really have got behind the birds as individuals as well. So I just want to introduce you quickly to 2 of the very important birds from our project. So the bird on the left is our resident female. This is CJ7. She's not actually from the Poole Harbour population. She's from Rutland Water. She was actually ringed by Tim back in 2015 at a nest there. Both of her grandfathers were birds that were translocated to Rutland. So she does have connections to translocation, but she happened to be stopping over in Poole Harbour as a 2-year-old bird. The first year she returned to the UK, and she came across 8 young ospreys that we just released as part of the translocation project. And we basically tricked her into thinking that there was a really productive population in Poole Harbour, which just goes to show a really strong example of that conspecific attraction, just how powerful that draw can be, particularly for those female birds entering a new population. So she's come back every summer since then in the hopes of breeding herself. And in 2021, she paired up with 022. This is a male that we did release. So he's displaying that natal philopatry that I described. He came back 2 years later. We released him in 2019. He came back in 2021 and they paired up. And people were able to watch that process via the live stream web cameras that we've put out on some of the artificial nests. Like I said, ospreys take very readily to those. They've become real celebrities. And actually the picture on the bottom left there, that's a statue of each of the 2 of them that was made by Paul Green, wildlife artist from Suffolk. That's at our local performing arts centre in Poole. I think it goes to show really how lovely it is, how much the community has taken the ospreys on board. And that's always something that's going to be a major aim and benefit of these translocation projects. But obviously the ultimate aim is that we do get breeding pairs and they sort of recolonize the area. And thankfully this year we saw that for the first time since 1847, ospreys bred in southern England. 022 and CJ7 produced 2 chicks. They were both female, and in early July we went down, we went up the tree, collected the birds, and and they will ring just like their parents, so that they can be identified and monitored throughout their lifetime. Unfortunately, one of those chicks was actually predated by a goshawk, which is another recovering raptor species, and also a natural predator of ospreys. So whilst it's unfortunate and will probably represent to some extent a knockback for the project, it is something natural that we will almost undoubtedly continue to see as these two species sort of recover in line with each other. But really happily, the other chick survived well. She left on migration at the end of August, and we hope that in 2 years' time, when she's a mature adult, we might see her back in the UK. But obviously, one pair does not constitute a healthy population. We've obviously got, this has been a major milestone year for us, but there's a long way to go yet before we have a self-sustaining population. And just to give you an idea of what that might look like, I wanted to give you an example from some of my PhD research on the Scottish population. So over the course of 50 years, from 1954, well, just over 50 years, to 2007, this was the pattern of the number of nesting ospreys in the Highland and Grampian region of Scotland. You can see that it follows this very typical kind of population growth curve, where you get that slow but exponential growth initially, then kind of a steady period where it's kind of at its fastest, and then as territories get taken up, resources become limited, the population sort of plateaus. And it's very typical, it's very encouraging, and actually for a species that was completely extinct over this area, that's a phenomenal recovery, and one that should be celebrated as a real conservation success story. And you might expect that the spatial growth would look something very similar, but actually it's very different. So the mean annual growth of the Scottish osprey population is about 2.4 kilometres per year. And if that was sort of a linear process, then it would look something like that on the graph. But what we see instead is this really stepwise progression, where actually the majority of the kind of recolonization and the expansion of the population spatially is actually carried out by a very small number of pioneering pairs. And those individuals are really fascinating, and that's something that I'd like to pursue further during the course of my study, because what we want to know is, what is it that's driving the nest site selection, not only in these individuals, but also in the individuals that don't disperse further. So one of the things, like I mentioned, was conspecific attraction. We see this in the Scottish osprey population. So if we generate some random points across the whole of the Scottish study area, and we compare them to the actual nest sites that ospreys selected, you can see that the points that would the true nests are much more likely to be closer together to each other than random points. So ospreys are actively selecting nest sites that are closer to each other than not, which is very interesting. And also, again, you can see these pioneering pairs. There's almost this separate cluster of birds that are just doing this completely different thing, which is really fascinating and something worth pursuing. We also know there's lots of other environmental factors that might be important. So ospreys are species that nest in the tops of trees. So we expect woodland or the presence of trees to be something that's important to their nest site selection. But actually, it's surprising just how much. So in a radius of 2 kilometres around each nest, there's actually about 51% of that area is all woodland, which is interesting when you think about it, because apart from needing a tree to nest in, ospreys have no other requirement for woodland. They are a fish-eating species. They're not hunting in the woodlands. They are just, they're reliant on water bodies for most of the rest of their survival. So that's a very interesting figure, and something that I'm interested in unpicking further. But then also things like water bodies, lots of other environmental factors that could play a role, and the things that I hope to investigate. And once we understand these preferences on a population scale like this, but also hopefully on an individual scale as well, we'll do some individual level studies, we can use that understanding of the drivers and also the consequences in terms of breeding success to drive and to motivate and modify our conservation strategies to best optimize the recovery of not just this species, but other species as well, because we are in a dire place, really, not just locally, nationally, internationally in terms of the depletion of the natural world. We need species recovery to be accelerated as much as possible. We need to use our understanding to the best of our abilities to inform that. And we need leadership of individuals to drive that forward. And I've been very fortunate throughout my career so far to have worked alongside a lot of very inspiring leaders. So from my colleagues at Birds Pool Harbour, the volunteers that we have, the stakeholders we work with, the Roy Dennis Wildlife Foundation team, my supervisors and colleagues at Bournemouth University, and now thanks to OLF, I also have a brand new cohort of peers of early career conservationists who demonstrate just incredible leadership and very inspiring leadership. And I just want to say thank you very much to Tim and the rest of the Osprey Leadership Foundation team and all of the members of that who have sort of driven that forward and created some.
Well, I don't know if anyone else has lost Brittany, but I have. Anyway, fortunately, I think we were getting to the end of her talk. So, oh, she's back. It's okay. Thank goodness for that.
Hello. I don't know what happened.
No, I don't know. But anyway, I think you got to the end, haven't you?
I think so. What was the last thing you heard me say?
It was thanking everyone you've worked with, and
it was how brilliant you were, wasn't it, Tim?
No, no. Don't embarrass me like that. But yeah, no, definitely. I just want to say, and actually Becky sent me a message during that talk as well, that between us, we've heard a lot of Osprey talks over the years. That is right up there with them all. It was fantastic. So thank you very much. It was really fascinating. And you absolutely kept the time. I know you were worried about it, but you've more than kept the time. So I'm very impressed. So that means we've just got a few minutes before we finish for questions. So the first question comes from Steve Davis, who's asking, have you got any thoughts on how many breeding pairs Poole Harbour could host?
Yes, so we think because the sort of the habitat and the sort of the scale of the habitat is quite similar to Rutland in terms of the foraging habitat, we expect that something similar could sort of be seen in the 20-kilometre radius or so around Poole Harbour. So we're talking about maybe 10 breeding pairs within kind of East Dorset, sorry. You know, but the thing is, we're quite different to Rutland in that we've got all this expansive coastline alongside adjacent to us. So we fully expect that pairs will disperse down into Devon, up into Hampshire and further afield. So whether that will mean that actually we get fewer pairs locally because there's so much habitat available to them, I don't know. Maybe it'll form part of my PhD thesis. But yeah, a very good question. We certainly think that in terms of Poole Harbour and what it can sustain in terms of providing food for birds, there's no limitation there really. It'll be in terms of the territories, because during the migration season, so during August, September, there can be days where we have maybe even 20 plus ospreys all using the harbour at the same time. And it's, you know, there's plenty of space, not only for them, but for all the other species as well, and people. So yeah, the limiting factor will probably be just how close the ospreys want to nest to each other, which will probably, like the data shows, we expect will probably be sort of within 3 kilometres of each other, maybe.
Thank you very much. Now, the questions are coming in thick and fast, so I'm going to determine that we're going to finish on time. So we've got 5 minutes.
Okay.
Colette is asking some quick fire questions. Colette is asking, I imagine Poole Harbour is also a human recreation area. How are humans and birds coexisting, and are there any problems? Yeah,
so we actually had one issue this weekend where the wind was really strong and some kite surfers got blown actually towards one of the sort of wildlife refuge areas, and that did scare a lot of the birds. But on the whole, there's a lot of collaboration going on amongst organisations to try and sort of resolve that, and actually there's lots of designated areas within Poole Harbour for recreation and for birds, and a large part of the harbour itself is actually, the land itself is designated nature reserve. So we'd like to think that it's actually a very good example of how people and nature can coexist.
And I agree with that very much. Bethan's asking, do you think there could be any genetic link between the pioneering pairs, i.e. is an offspring of a pioneering pair more likely to be a pioneer itself?
Very interesting. Yes, perhaps. It's probably too much to go into in a minute-long answer, but so something I will look into, I'm hoping to look into. We haven't got genetic data, obviously, because this is historical data from the last few decades, but we have got, because of the ringing data, we can probably build family trees and genealogies. So from that, so we can do sort of associations between parents, offspring and siblings, and hopefully to some extent, make an assessment of that. But yeah, it could well be.
Thank you. Valerie asks, how many more years are you translocating for?
We've got 2 years left on our translocation license. So we postponed this year because of the risks of bird flu, partly because there was sort of a lack of understanding really about the risk that was posed. Hopefully next year we'll be able to pick up with that again. So it's potentially going to be 2023 and 2024. If we see evidence that the population is really taking off and sort of becoming self-sustaining before then we would probably stop. But obviously at the moment we've just got the one pair, so we'll probably see the project through, I think.
Brilliant. And then finally, last question. This person says, I've been out on the Birds of Poole Harbour cruises this year and heard you mention the reintroduction of other species such as chough and beaver. When do you think this will happen?
We're in discussions about choughs. Unfortunately, that probably won't be next year because they have to breed the choughs, they're captive bred choughs for release. So they would need quite a bit of notice to start that process. The beavers is literally just awaiting government approval. So if they said tomorrow that it could go ahead, I know that they know that there's a population of beavers that they can source from in Scotland. We could maybe even have beavers by the new year. But they've also been saying that we're just waiting for government approval for about the last year. So I'm sorry, I can't give a more definitive answer about that. That's fine. And I have to say, the final three comments are all just saying what an inspiring talk that was, and then the fact that all three talks this evening have been really fantastic. So yeah, thank you very much to you, Brittany, and to everybody else, to Andy and also to Amy for your really outstanding talks. I think it's fair to say that all three of you are doing some really, really important work for nature, and you should all be very proud of the work you're doing. So thank you for giving up your evening and giving us, telling us about your work. And thank you to everybody who's joined us tonight. It's been great. I hope you've enjoyed it. And particular thanks to those of you among the audience tonight who are regular supporters of OLF. We really appreciate your support, and we literally couldn't be doing the work we're doing without you. And also to those of you who are supporting the Evolving Conservation Leaders programme as mentors. Again, we're really grateful for all the work you're doing for us. So yeah, thank you all very much. And thank you also to Bethan Mason for organising tonight, for getting those speakers together. You've done a great job as ever, Bethan. So thank you all very much. And please keep an eye on our website, ospreylf.org, for more news on the foundation and the work we're doing in events, and also our social media. But yeah, thank you very much for joining us tonight, and hopefully see you soon.